No Ajay.
Hi everyone, Anthony Fidera. We're gonna do a review of the new No Age album, An Object. These guys are a California rock duo. This is their latest full-length LP. No Age, if you haven't heard of them, they're definitely a group you want to get into if you're into lo-fi rock, lo-fi indie, noise rock and pop, punk music. I would say that No Age delivers rock and roll that has this high, extreme amount of energy and just distortion and volume, but also there's a lot of sound play in their music too, with some ambient interludes, outros, and intros, legitimately beautiful walls of ethereal guitar sound. And even though toying with a lot of these styles has earned them comparisons to great acts like Dinosaur Jr. or Pixies, My Bloody Valentine and Slow Dive, Sonic Youth, Mission of Burma, there isn't one band that I would specifically say that No Age sounds exactly like. Whether you're talking about stuff coming out today or in the past, because I don't feel like there's a single band in the underground right now that is making noise rock with the same kind of detail, especially ethereal details, that No Age typically does. Even at their most lo-fi back in 2007, their songs were incredibly textured and colorful, loaded with sounds that were conjured from guitar feedback, guitar freakouts, loops, effects. I feel like the band really kind of came to a pinnacle with their sound and broke out with it on the 2008 album Nouns, an LP that I love from front to back. It's exciting, thrilling, tense, sort of simple melodically, but still very catchy. The band ended up following that album with a pretty decent EP that, in my opinion, showed them working with a better recording quality, some newer sounds. I felt like there were some really interesting progressions coming over the horizon. But the band's next album, Everything in Between, unfortunately, I did not enjoy it quite as much as Nouns or even Weirdo Rippers. I felt like there was an element of reservation on this album that kind of held it back and kept it from being as exciting. It was almost as if a lot of the sounds that No Age was working with, instead of being wild and free and kind of having this visceral rock edge, were kind of a little more mid-paced and subdued in order to make a recording that was a bit cleaner, a little more sterile. This album made me kind of miss their lo-fi roots, which is exactly the direction they're headed in on this new LP. And it's really difficult for me to describe this LP, describe how it makes me feel, because it sort of threw me for a loop. It is a bit of a surprise because I feel like No Age does go for a different vibe on this album, and truly, part of me really enjoys it, but part of me is very cold toward it as well. As far as positives go that give this album personality, this is definitely No Age's most abstract album. It's one of the more experimental albums in their catalog. I would say it's actually pretty even-tempered and consistent too. A lot of No Age's previous material featured tracks that were very, very slow, soft, or ambient, and then bunched those up with tracks that were high-speed, aggressive, and fiery. While neither was necessarily bad, it's not like No Age really found a way to make these slower tracks meld with the faster tracks without making them kind of feel like just merely a forgettable interlude or a detour. On this LP, with nearly every song on here featuring pretty much the same recording quality, it's made for an album that doesn't really feel like a mixtape or a compilation. It feels like a bit of a concept LP. Part of me also kind of wonders whether or not this will go down as No Age's most boring album. And if not that, it's definitely the album so far in their catalog that has the narrowest appeal. Because when I think about it in respect to previous material, songs like Come On Stimmung, for example, which is maybe the only track on this LP that I could say has legitimate single potential. Even when No Age tries to be ferocious on this album, I'm not really finding a lot of power in this decidedly muddy recording. I would say there's actually kind of a dullness that persists throughout this entire LP. Again, I use the word decidedly because No Age has worked in lo-fi sounds before. I would say that there was kind of a similar dullness to their last album. I'm positively sure they're conscious of how this album sounds, how this album feels, and how it might impact how people perceive their music. I feel like deadening the sounds a little bit has actually made the music on this LP really live up to the title that they have given this album, An Object, because it really makes me feel like I'm listening to music that I can only observe, like it's this thing that is separate from me and it's like sitting there on the table and I'm just kind of staring at it, as opposed to the music on Nouns, which I felt was something that just bled out of my speakers like a giant destruction rainbow of psychedelic punk magic, scrambling my emotions and consciousness. And Object feels like so much more of a static experience. It's like that soundscape side overtakes the punk side on this LP and takes a group of songs written in No Age's typical style for the most part, and then melts them, fries them, strips them back a little bit until we have these tracks that feel brittle and warm and crackly and claustrophobic. I really feel like No Age is trying to get back to the basics of their earlier stuff and make a recording that has some kind of beauty in its flaws, in its shortcomings, in its damaged and broken presentation. And emotionally, there's a little bit of a shift on this album too, because for sure there are a lot of songs on this album that are pretty moody. And Dean Spunt's vocals on this LP definitely convey that as well. He's not really singing in that high-pitched, nasally yelp that blazed so many of the band's faster tracks on previous LPs, though there are occasions where it seems like he reaches up into that register. For the most part, he is kind of howling in this much lower voice on this album, and it seems to have a bit of a sadness to it. Even though there have been a lot of changes on this LP, I feel like No Age has stuck to their pretty simple melodies, songwriting, and vocal style, and I feel like they're putting just as much detail sonically, noise-wise, into their tracks. If you compare it to their last full-length album, I just feel that it's a lot less obvious because this is not a loud record. You've got all of these sounds being squeezed into this incredibly small space, and a lot of them drown each other out, really cancel each other out. Because again, this recording is very opaque, and another thing that sort of takes the guts right out of these tracks, or takes the excitement out of them, is that a lot of tracks here forego drums completely, or have drums that are just barely audible. And while that has led to An Object being way less intense, part of me loved hearing the band move into this slightly more difficult territory. Whether it be with somber songs like I Won't Be Your Generator, which lyrically I feel are very sort of depressing. Dean sort of singing on this track about not allowing this person to abuse him or sort of get power from him anymore, whether that be through having control over him or some kind of emotional command. And while he doesn't come across as the best vocalist of all time on this record, he falls very short of that mark, I feel there's an element of vulnerability, kind of in the same way that a Kimya Dawson song would be admirable. And the song An Impression, a track where Dean does reach up into that more nasally register of his, though he is singing a little deadpan on this track, there is still some kind of painful emotion in his voice, and I just love the tenderness of the ambient sounds kind of floating in the background behind his voice against these very subtle guitars. And the strings, I assume they're strings, that pop in toward the end of the track, they just really seep in very slowly. They're gorgeous. One of the more beautiful moments I've heard on a Sub Pop record this year. There are some louder tracks on here, but they can be just as off-putting, honestly. The opening track on here, No Ground, has just one single snare, just mixed up with all these very fuzzy guitars. It has such a demo kind of feel to it, but Dean's lower vocals all over this track are kind of wild, they're weird. While it did catch me in this really weird way at first, I found it to be slightly alluring the more I listened to it. There's a pretty audible bass line on this track too, which is also kind of a rarity in No Age's music. And the song Lockbox, I like that we have this weird floor tom roll mixed very loudly in the left channel, and that's pretty much all we're hearing in terms of percussion for a majority of the track. I just have to emphasize again how stripped back this album feels. It's like No Age was really trying to take everything they had built up until this point, smash it down into its most basic foundation, and then just redo everything. It's like they've really hit the reset button. And while it has led to some interesting ideas, sounds, noises, and aesthetics, and I feel that No Age has delivered some songs on here that do shine past the lo-fi recording. They didn't need a good recording to be captivating. There are still songs on this record that I do find to be completely boring and most likely would have benefited from some more vivid or more high-pitched or distorted sounds. I'm kind of feeling a strong 5 to a light 6 on this thing. If you've given it a listen, what did you think of it? Did you love it? Hate it? Why? What do you think I should review next? And that's it. This review is my opinion. If you don't like it, here's a straw. I want to give a shout out to Thomas and Vice Portugal, who I recently did a little interview with. You can find a link for that in the description box. Only the strong subscribe. All mistakes were intentional. Anthony Fantano, No Age, forever.